Welcome back. Now we're going to dive into an important aspect of Azure networking called Azure Firewall. Azure Firewall is a fully managed cloud-based network security service provided by Microsoft Azure. It acts as a barrier, monitoring and controlling inbound and outbound traffic based on user-defined rules. Now let's explore how to set it up. The first thing I'm going to do is start by provisioning an Azure Firewall resource in the Azure portal. I can do this by clicking on Create a Resource. I can simply search for Azure Firewall from the search box here. I'll give Firewalls a click and click on Create Firewall. Now let's configure basic settings for the firewall. So I'll start by choosing my subscription, choose a resource group. Let's go with the AZ-900 resource group. Next, we'll need to give our firewall a name. So how about we call this AZ-900 FW01. And our region is South Africa. For the SKU, let's go with standard. And by the way, the firewall SKU refers to the different tiers or the different edition of Azure Firewall service that are available for deployment. And for firewall management, let's stick with the use of Azure policy to manage this firewall. This is because they are more flexible to work with than the rule-based system. So we need to create a new firewall policy here. So I'll click on Add New. And let's give this a name. How about we call this AZ-900 Firewall Policy. I will stay with standard and click on OK. For virtual networks, we can choose to create a new one or use an existing one. How about we use one that we've created in our previous lesson? So let's choose one of those. And let's go with VNet 1. The Azure Firewall requires a subnet be created, and the subnet needs to be named Azure Firewall Subnet. So I'm going to do that real quick off camera and be back to fix this error. Alright, so I'm gonna head to create the subnet in the VNet1 subnet. And what you will need to do is to refresh. So you might have to type in all these details over again, but you can see it's not prompting us for the error this time around. The next thing you will need to do is to give the firewall a public IP address. So you can use one that you already have, or you create a new one. How about we create a new one for this purpose? So I'll click on Add New and call this Firewall IP. Click on OK. We also have forced tunneling. Forced tunneling is going to allow you direct all internet-bound traffic from your Azure Firewall to your on-premises firewall. So we're going to leave that disabled and click on Review and Create. And let's click on Create. Once the deployment is successful, we're now going to have a provisioned Azure Firewall with basic settings configured. The next thing we'll need to do is to create a default route. To create an Azure default route, we'll need to set up route tables. So we can search for route tables. The search box here. Let's give that a click. And click on Create Route Table. But we know the drill by now. Choose a valid subscription. Choose the resource group to house this route table. Choose your region and the name for your route table. I'm going to call this AZ-900 Firewall RT for routing table. And there is propagate gateway route. So you can either choose yes or no. You can leave it turned off if you like to prevent propagation of on-premises routes to your network interface. So let's click on Review plus Create. Now we click on Create. Once deployment complete, we need to associate our VNet to this default route. Let's click on Go to Resource. And from our route table blade, we'll click on Subnets. And let's click on Associate. Now for the subnet, I have a number of subnets that I've created or that I've associated with this VNet. But the one that I'm interested in using this for is my front end nodes. So I'm going to select the front nodes subnet. Next, let's create our default route. We're going to click on Routes and let's click on Add. How about we call this AZ-900 Firewall Route. And the destination address prefix is going to be IP addresses. And for the destination IP address, how about we use 0.0.0.0/0, which is similar to saying any network. This default route specifies the next hop for traffic that does not match any specific routing table entry. For next hop type, we'll go with virtual appliance. And this is the destination for network traffic that is not matched by any firewall rule. It helps to determine the action taken by Azure Firewall when it receives network traffic that does not meet any defined rule criteria. And the next hop address is going to be the address used for routing network traffic that is not matched by any firewall rule. So here we're going to type in the private IP address of the firewall that we just created. So I'm going to quickly copy the private address of my Azure Firewall and paste it here. And let's click on Add. With this setup, every traffic will now have to pass through the Azure Firewall. And this means that you won't be able to connect to your VMs. You won't be able to surf the internet on the VMs until you create specific rules for them. Next, let's configure the necessary network rules to make things work. The first network rule that we're going to create will be one that will allow access to two addresses on port 53, that is DNS port. I'm back to the portal now. Let's click on our resource group. And to create network rules, you need your firewall policy. So I'm going to give that a click. I'll click on network rules and click add a rule collection. I'm going to name this firewall policy rule 1. The rule collection type in this case is network. And for priority, we can choose a number between 100 to 65,000. So how about we go with 150? The action is going to be allowed. And for rule collection group, we're going to stay with default network rule collection group. Now let's give our rule a name. We'll call this allow DNS. We're working with IP address. And for source IP address, how about we allow this entire 10.0.0.0 block with a mask of /16. For protocol, we're going to choose TCP and UDP. This is because DNS use both TCP and UDP. Destination port is going to be 53 for DNS. Destination type is going to be IP address in this example. And the destination IP address that we're going to go with would be 209.244.168. .0.3, comma, and let's add the second address, which is 209.244.0.4. These are just sample public DNS servers that are operated by Layer 3. Here you can use any public DNS address of your choice, so you don't have to go with this one. You can decide to replace this one with your own public DNS address. So we're going to click on Add. The next thing we want to do is to create an application rule. And in this example, we're going to create an application rule that is going to allow access to one domain name. And the domain name that we're going to be using in this example would be bing.com. So we're back to our firewall policy. This time, let's click on Application Rules. And we'll click on Add Rule Collection. I'm going to name this Application Collection 1. Be sure to give it an intuitive name. Next is the rule collection type. This time is application. And priority, how about we make this 151? The action is going to be allowed. And for collection group, we're going to choose default application rule collection group. We're going to name our rule allow Bing. We need to specify the source IP address or range of IP address. So how about we go with 10.0.0.0/16. So I want to allow it for the entire block. For protocols, we're working with two protocols here, HTTP and HTTPS. Destination is going to be FQDN, which stands for Fully Qualified Domain Name. And our destination is going to be www.bing.com. And let's click on Add. Oh, the Add button is not highlighted. There is a mistake here. This should be /16. 10.0.0.0/16. And let's click on Add. The next thing we'll need to do is to create destination NAT rules that will allow us to establish remote desktop connections to our virtual machine through the firewall. Because you're going to notice that you no longer have access to connect to your VM via remote desktop anymore. That's why we need to set up the DNAT rule. So I'm back again in my Azure policy window. This time, let's click on DNAT rules and click on Add a Rule Collection. Let's name this RDP rule. The collection type is DNAT. And for priority, how about we go with 180? And under Rule Collection Group, we're going to choose Default NAT Rule Collection Group. The rule name, I'll choose RDP. NAT. For source address, let's work with a wildcard this time. So we'll use asterisk as our wildcard mask. That is, the connection might be coming from any PC at all. For protocol, we'll choose TCP. And port number is 3389. That's the port number for RDP. Destination type is going to be IP address. And the destination IP address is going to be the public IP address of the firewall that we created earlier. So I'm going to quickly come fetch the public IP address of my firewall. So this is my firewall, and here's where we can get the public IP address from. You click on public IP configuration, and here you have it. This is the public IP address. So I'm just going to copy this and paste the address here. And we want it to be translated to an IP address. And the IP address that we need it to be translated to would be the IP address of the VM that we're trying to connect to. Here's the VM that I'm trying to use. So I'm going to scroll down to copy the private IP address of my VM here. I want the public IP address of my firewall to be translated to the IP address of my VM, which is my web server. And the port is the same, 3389, the port for RDP. I'm going to click on Add. Next, we'll need to change the primary and the secondary DNS address for the host that we want to test with. I want to test with this host right here, my web server 1 host. And to change the DNS address of a VM, you click on Networking, click on the network interface. And from here, I'm going to click on DNS servers. And I'll change the settings now from inherit from VNet to custom. I'll type in the first DNS address that we configured earlier, 209.244.0.3. And for the secondary DNS server, we have 209.244.0.4. And click on Save. So now let's test and ensure that everything is working fine. Now I've launched Remote Desktop and I've typed in the IP address, that is the public IP address of the Azure Firewall that we've created. I'm going to connect and type in my password. And as you can see, we're able to connect to our virtual machine through Remote Desktop. How about we launch Internet Explorer and see if we can have access to the Bing website? Good. We're able to access Bing. And now let's try any other website other than Bing. Let's go with google.com. As you can see, it is denied, and the reason is because there are no rules found. Let's try one more website, www.hp.com. So this is also been denied. The only FQDN that is going to be allowed will be the one that we defined in the application rule of the firewall policy. Remember that Azure Firewall is a powerful tool for securing your network traffic in Azure, and it offers capabilities to protect your resources, control access, and ensure compliance. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lesson.